Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We protect the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, and Shanks Ferry people, and I hope we care for these lands as well as these native peoples. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so precious and beautiful, they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore these special places by creating trails and planting trees. These preserves are then opened for you and I to use, to bike, hunt, fish, and bird, 365 days per year. Places like Shanks Ferry, House Rock, Wizard Ranch, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format for tonight's lecture will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation with 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll include your questions as part of the conversation. This is the fourth lecture of our 24-25 winter season. Our next Nature Hour will be February 5th on exploring our emancipation landscape with our very own Peggy Eppig. You can learn more and pre-register for this lecture on our website and a bunch of other interpretive events coming up, lancasterconservancy.org under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support. And tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors who include the Wenger Group, Clark Associates, Nimblist, Electron Energy, Eurofins, J Group, Dart Container, Prana, Armstrong, Commonwealth Financial Associates, PP&L, Cargus, and Penstone. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, Sustaining Humans and Nature Together, with Dr. Oswald Schmitz, author of this amazing book, The New Ecology, Rethinking a Science for the Anthropocene. Schmitz is the Oastler Professor of Population and Community Ecology in the Yale University School of the Environmental. His research aims to make sense of nature's complexity that comes from indiscrepancies among the variety of carnivore, herbivore, and plant species that coexist within ecosystems. These insights help to inform environmental stewardship to enhance the conservation of wildlife species and ensure the sustainability of ecosystems, their functions, and the services that they provide to humankind. At Yale, he teaches courses on the role of humans in nature and how humans can develop the means to coexist harmoniously with nature. His book, The New Ecology, Rethinking a Science for the Anthropocene, encapsulates much of his thinking about species and ecosystems, making ecological science accessible to a broader readership. Thanks for being here with us tonight.
Thanks very much, Keith, and thanks for that kind introduction. Pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can get this going now. Yep. Okay. Thank you all for joining. Slideshow. And I'm assuming everybody can see this. Thank you very much for joining in tonight. What I would like to do is present some food for thought, really. For some of you, it might be just reinforcing your worldview about, humans and nature living together alongside each other. For others, it might be a different way of thinking about nature conservation, one that really does intimately involve humans. To start off, let's think about nature the way many of us try to think about nature, or conservation has historically thought about nature. And starting with this wonderful forested vista, mountainous, lots of trees. You don't see much human activity on this landscape. You might even say it's pristine, although I don't like the word pristine because it really implies, in the usage and conservation anyway, that humans don't belong. It's pristine because people aren't there. And I would argue that people have always been part of nature throughout history, beginning with our First Nations communities that lived here, thousands of years ago. So I just sort of look at this lovely vista of a landscape and think of nature as not only this vista, it could be the Alleghenies, parts of the Alleghenies, but it isn't. It's a part of the Adirondacks in northern New York. But a similar vista might be in the Alleghenies or elsewhere in the United States, in fairly rural areas. Now, if you're looking at nature like this, as a scientist, we tend to drill down and look into, open the hood a little bit and look inside the landscape. And if you do that, you also notice that there's a whole rich variety of species. And here we've got wildflowers depicted. We have a whole variety of insects, birds, mammals. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the kinds of species that you might see in this region. But it's still a magnificent sort of palette of colors and living organisms. And that's something that we celebrate as people. Our connection to nature is through the species on these landscapes. But also as ecologists, we profoundly appreciate that these species have evolved to provide functional roles. And so what we also do is sort of think about nature in a different way. We try to categorize these organisms, this rich biodiversity, in terms of the roles they play in ecological systems and their interdependencies. So you might look at one box being all the plants together as a way of sort of characterizing the essence of what you're seeing in that landscape. And then you might have a bunch of herbivore species that feed on those plants. It could be a moose, it could be a beaver, it could be caterpillars of butterflies, right? And then we also have carnivores like wolves. We have weasels that are also carnivores in this landscape, but we could also have spider predators or praying mantids or whatever. And all of these organisms, by virtue of living and interacting with each other, they recycle nutrients. Not only plants, the leaves fall in the autumn period and then become part of what's called the detritus pool. But herbivores, they die, they live and die, and their bodies go into the detritus pool. They also urinate and defecate, which also enters here, and it's decomposed, and that's what the soil is made of. Nutrients are released, and so plants are nourished by these interdependencies. And so, in a functional way, what we also look at is that these species together, because of their interdependencies, create a natural economy of production and consumption and recycling. So the plants, they produce energy, they produce sugars through photosynthesis. They convert sunlight and carbon dioxide into plant biomass. That energy, the sugars in the plants get eaten by the herbivores. The herbivores turn it into their body tissue, so another form of production. And then they're consumed by carnivores and produced again. Then there's the recycling. So it's fundamentally what we call a circular economy. So species together, they intimately tied together through their independencies, and they create what we call a circular economy. And we call it an archetypal circular economy because our own business economies are sort of emulating what nature already does. And if we think about nature in this kind of way, we can quickly appreciate, all the functionality of it is really important to sustaining us too. So if we disrupt all of this natural economy, we might actually harm ourselves if we depend on this, as herbivores also consuming plants or carnivores also eating herbivores. The question, though, is if there are only a few functional roles, like plants, herbivores, carnivores, whatever, why do we have so many different species? Why is there such a rich diversity of species to begin with if we only need a few to fill the functional roles? And I don't want to get into a really deep technical presentation of how biodiversity evolves, but I just want to sort of give you an appreciation from an economic sense why there's opportunity for so many species to live together and what nature provides us in that capacity. So for example, as in all economies, there's an opportunity for any entity to seize upon opportunities and innovate and to make a living through competitive and cooperative strategies, right? So in human-created market economies, we call those entities businesses or industries. In nature-created economies, the entities are the species themselves that do things. And so let's just think about, organisms seizing opportunities and trying to innovate so that they can actually thrive and do well. And let's suppose we have a landscape here where on the surface, we have different nutrients. This could be nitrogen or phosphorus or calcium or potassium or magnesium. And so, the soil surface is going to be rich with nutrients. It might also be pretty homogeneous if you fertilize it with nitrogen. But also if you go into the soil layer, there are other, elements that are really important that are also distributed through the depth of the soil. Copper, zinc, chlorine, manganese, iron, cobalt, a whole variety of different elements that are in the soil, both horizontally distributed and vertically distributed in 2 dimensions. And so, when you think about plant species, let's suppose as a precursor or a starter or the, Adam or Eve plant, what you might have is a few plants that look alike. And so they're becoming quite competitive for the resources at the surface of the soil. And so you might have an individual of that group, a member of that group, that actually has slightly longer or deeper roots. And so it can go into the soil a little deeper and make it take advantage of different sets of soil nutrients that aren't being utilized by these individuals that have shallower roots, right? And so what you can have then is the evolution of a new kind of species that has deeper roots that can coexist with these other individuals from the other species. And so what they're doing is they're starting to partition the use of available resources. So the innovation here is having deeper roots and growing to different depths, and then taking advantage of other nutrients that might be available and not being utilized by these individuals here. And so you could do the same for sunlight, right? So if you have certain plants that, are living in shady conditions, one might actually grow taller, even though it might have the same roots, grow taller to be able to compete for sunlight. And so you have these 2 different kinds of strategies where you could actually elongate your roots and grow deeper into the soil, or you could elongate your stems and leaves and grow higher above the ground into the canopy. And so if you just think about these different potential combinations, and just for a simple sake, just let's think about 2 traits, that is the roots and the stems, and we think about 3 different levels. You could either be short, medium, or long rooted, or short, medium, and long stemmed. And if you look at the various combinations, you get 9 different possible combinations where you have low stature, low rooting depth, to tall stature and deep rooting depth, and every combination in between. And as you can see, if these different types evolve as species, what you end up having is 9 different species that are partitioning. They've innovated to use different parts of the ecosystem and take advantage of nutrients and sunlight and water in different parts of that soil profile and the above ground profile. And so this is just a hypothetical example, but if you look at a prairie grassland, this is from a tall grass prairie, that you might find in Illinois, and historically have found in Illinois, and all the way into parts of Pennsylvania and Ohio and upstate New York also. You do find you have different functional forms, right? So you have all of this variety: short statured above ground, deep rooted, in between, tall and shorter rooted. So you have all sorts of combinations. And what's amazing here, think about this, in a tall grass prairie, the rooting can go all the way down to 15 feet into the soil, right? So these plants can be very deeply rooted. And so the soil here is really, really important part of the living and the place to innovate in this world. Sometimes you have more plant matter, plant biomass below ground than you do above ground. Notice you only go up about 8 feet here versus 15 feet down here. And so you have these different functional forms. But if you squint a little bit, you'll notice that a few different species have sort of similar forms, right? So what I've done for you is just highlighted, the different species by connecting these colored brackets to show you that species that have similar traits. They're different species, but they, have similar functional roles in this ecological system. And this is what we call redundancy. And redundancy is also important. We don't need every single species necessarily. The functional redundancy, think of it as a portfolio of similar stocks or whatever, so that you can draw on one if another one's underperforming, or if something gets harmed. Let's say this species gets harmed by a pesticide, there are other species here that can fulfill that functional role and take over. So it provides a little bit of insurance that we can sustain our natural economy And so it makes nature less fragile. So diversity is important in several ways, the uniqueness of the different morphological types, but also the fact that there is some redundancy among species. And the same principle applies to trees, right? You can have tall trees that are shallow rooted, tall trees that are deeply rooted, smaller trees that are shallow rooted, smaller trees that are deeply rooted, or just little shrubs. And the same principles that I've talked about in terms of the evolution of functional forms applies to mammals as well. So this is just an African savanna, and you have 3 different species eating the same food, but they're eating it from different parts of a tree, right? So the giraffe has evolved to eat high up in the canopy, the kudu at an intermediate level, and a little duiker. For those of you who don't know what a duiker is, it's like a little tiny deer the size of a rabbit. And they're a lot of fun to watch running around the understory, but they eat the vegetation from this vegetation here in the understory. So they're all eating the same thing, but partitioning it among space so they're not competing with each other. And also, you know, they have mammals have different digestive morphologies as well, which determines what they eat in terms of the vegetation. So we have things like concentrate selectors. So they're very specific about what they're eating and really concentrating the nutrients. Others are intermediate types, and then there are others that are really good at eating grass and roughage. And being able to eat really poor quality food, right? And regardless of the species, you know, you get the same sorts of feeding types. The same principles apply to, you know, shorebirds and where they feed along a shoreline and how deeply they can go and how they partition space. Or, you know, if you go into a forest, you see a whole rich diversity of warblers. And these warbler species partition a tree canopy in different locations to feed on the insects that live in those different places. And so they have different adaptations to move into the canopy or flit around the side of the canopy. And their beak and mouth part morphologies are also a little different to accommodate the different kinds of insects you might see on the, you know, outer surface of a tree versus inside. And then here's the classic Darwin's finches in the Galapagos and all the various different functional morphologies that they have to actually partition the seed bank from very heavy, thick seeds that some consume to very thin millet-like seeds that other ones with nimble beaks can consume. And so, again, all of these species are innovating so that they can take advantage of nature and together really create an integrated functioning system. And that integrated functioning system, Aldo Leopold, sort of the father of modern conservation and environmental ethics, you know, basically likened the species in nature to cogs and wheels that are essentially critical to keeping the ecosystem machine functioning. So you can sort of imagine species fitting together because they have their unique roles, but together they fit together to make sure that the overall the ecosystem functioning is sustainable. And if you really look at it scientifically, I'm not presenting data points, I'm just presenting you a conceptual figure of what we're learning, is that, you know, as you increase the species or the functional type diversity, the efficiency of nutrient use goes up to a point. And the point is it diminishes over space and diversity simply because more and more species are packing in. And you get that redundancy happening so that you don't get more and more nutrient use efficiency. It maximizes out. But if you have very few species, you know, let's say they're all short-rooted, there's a lot of soil space where there are still nutrients that can be used. And that's what happens when you add in more functional types. And those functional types then contribute to the productivity in nature, you know, that production. When we were talking about an economy having production and consumption, they contribute to enhancing the productivity of nature. And why do we need productivity? Well, that's really to support the ecosystem services that nature provides us, right? It can be clean, you know, the provisioning services that we use to maintain our livelihoods, such as clean water or clean rivers for fish or wood production or pollination, or providing cool temperatures, getting into regulating services or to control flooding or to purify water. There are cultural services that we also take advantage of through recreation. Keith talked about, you enjoying the properties that the Lancaster Conservancy owns and conserves for your benefit. Recreation, aesthetics, those are all important roles that biodiversity plays for you, and you get to realize that immediately. And then there are the supporting services, like plants support animals. Herbivorous animals support carnivores. So the supporting services are also reliant on productivity. So productivity is really essential. The more productivity you have, the more opportunity to support these different ecosystem services. And so even in one patch of forest, you can imagine all of the different intricate ways that a forest ecosystem with all its rich diversity can contribute to all of the different ways that species can provide services to humankind. So, the way I go into a forest, I don't just think about, oh, aren't these trees wonderful? But I just try and imagine the hive of activity and the buzz that's going on as these organisms are interacting, they're breathing, they're taking up CO2, they're growing, they're producing nutrients. It's just a hive of activity, and there's an energy, it's a palpable energy that's happening in there if you take the time to just spend time in nature and think about that aspect. But there are two kinds of things that nature can provide, and that's the way we sort of categorize them. The one is typically the products. Productivity produces things that we use by extracting from nature through resource use. And in a classic forest ecosystem, that would be, sawnwood, panels, pulp and paper, wood energy, which is the value added from logging those forests. And that value added goes into our economy, right? For construction, for furniture, for packaging. So there's a production component and then a consumption and production component here. But there's also, if you leave things in place, there are also really important services that we provide people. Biodiversity, just maintaining the rich diversity, improving water quality, recreational value. One of the things we care about is carbon dioxide storage. The problem is oftentimes a lot of these values aren't easily monetized, right? You can't really oftentimes put an economic value on ecosystem services as easily as you can here, because that goes through a supply chain and through a market. And so oftentimes we ignore this because we can't monetize it easily, even though this could be just as vital in terms of supporting this kind of production. So if we eroded all of this, you wouldn't get this either. So, it isn't, basically resources versus the environment or business versus the environment. The environment is really crucial to maintaining business as well. So they should really be thought of as going in hand. But then we have trade-offs. Either we take from nature to use elsewhere, or we keep in nature in support of other things that we value. And conservation and the kind of things that I'm going to talk about, stewardship, are really about thinking about how do we reconcile these trade-offs so that we get win-win on both sides of this sort of services versus products trade-off. Again, a classic example where you can monetize things implicitly. So for example, this is the Catskills of upstate New York, and it's the watershed that actually, the Croton watershed and the upper Catskills that feed fresh water to New York City. In the early 1990s, I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but the US EPA was saying that New York's water treatment facility was really not up to speed and not doing a good enough job. And so New York would have to build a water treatment facility to provide fresh, clean water, drinking water to members of the city, citizens of the city. And they valued that in terms of billions of dollars, okay? Well, New York City said, well, we also already have a water supply area, but we got to maintain the landscape so that what we do on the land doesn't pollute that watershed. And so we can get delivery of clean, fresh water without building this expensive plant. So in a sense, if you sort of do what economists call imputing value, if this is worth billions of dollars to build, then this is worth billions of dollars to protect. It's a one-to-one swap, right? So instead of building it, you let nature be the water treatment plant. And so you can really provide value that way, even though you're not directly paying for this, although you might through taxpayers in New York City now. But it's really important to make sure that the beneficiaries of the service, that is citizens of New York, actually compensate the people who live here who might have other opportunities mitigated for transforming the land to protect the water quality, that they're compensated for that service they're providing. So it isn't just nature, it's about people actually, and their way of life on the landscape also being valued and compensated appropriately for. And the way that you make sure that you have clean water is that you protect the upland and you make sure you have a diversity of different trees. You use trees that grow nicely in upland or trees that actually grow well in lowland areas or on riversides. And so you need a whole rich diversity of plants to actually stabilize this landscape and ensure you have fresh water. Another example is protecting riparian areas. This is closer to home, urban forests. So what I'm talking about here is bringing nature not from the hinterland, but bringing nature into a city. Okay, and this watershed here, it's so clean that you can actually do trout fishing outside of a city. This is New Haven, Connecticut, where I live, and this is the Mill River watershed. And it's protected through water conservation, again, protecting that riparian zone. And look at how clean that water is. And that water ends up also contributing to New Haven's water supply. Now, by protecting this, again, New Haven doesn't have to spend a lot of effort with chemicals and everything to clean the drinking water. And if you think about it, it pays off in terms of lower taxes. Citizens of New Haven have to pay lower taxes for water for your purification because of the clean environment they have around here. So, there's really not a huge direct market value on this, but it does have dollar amounts, and it can be thousands, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars in value, depending on the size of the city and the size of the watershed. And the reason why it works in the New Haven watershed area is because they're protecting the aquatic diversity and that cyclic circular economy where you have organic matter being broken down. This is the detritus being broken down by a whole bunch of insect species, larvae, that transform all of this into nutrients that either feed the fish. That's why you can have fish, because you've got a vibrant insect community here, but it also supports plant production in this ecosystem also. And it's really because of all of this organic matter falling into here and being decomposed and recycled. So that takes us really to biodiversity in the urban realm. And so when we're starting to think about having nature encroach into the cities, we actually have to think about changing our popular conception of human-nature relationships away from what I started from, where we try and imagine nature being some hinterland area in the high northern realms of Canada and the United States, Alaska or something, or the Adirondacks, and actually be willing to think about nature being right in our backyard and as part of our environment. And this is another reason why I don't like the use of the word pristine, because then you can't really think of nature in your backyard, because if you think about pristine nature, it's got to be away from people. But this is a different way of looking at nature. Nature just has different instantiations. So you might have high wilderness in areas that are remotely away from human settlements. So there might be very low wilderness quality in the urban environment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have nature in this part of the world, because you can make this as natural as possible too for an urban environment, as I've just shown you with the watershed in New Haven. And here are other ways that you can accomplish this. So, people have done research on this and actually compared in the same city and accounting for people's economic well-being and controlling for all of the different factors causing people to live in different parts of a city. What they found is that people living in neighborhoods with high densities of roadway trees, neighborhoods like this as opposed to this, have different personal, physical, and mental health. They have higher quality. They feel younger. They have lower incidence of cardiac and metabolic ailments. Those are things you can't directly put a price on. If you think about medical expenses or expenses for medicine, then maybe that's a way of imputing that value. But you can't put a real easy price on that, but yet look at all of these benefits to our well-being, okay? It also encourages people to eat healthier diets for some reason. And it's not really because people are running around promoting it. They just feel healthier, and so they're encouraged to, or inspired to eat healthier diets, including servings of vegetables, fruits, and grains. And so when economists have sort of tried to figure out and impute the value of that, it's almost like you have $10,000 more personal income, even though you don't physically have that. It's just your way of life and your well-being gives you an equivalent of what that would cost, okay? So it's another way of thinking about the value of nature in your backyard. One of the things we're dealing with climate warming is really thinking about urban green spaces and using it as a cooling effect to overcome some of the heat island effects that we have in urban areas, right? Where we're getting spiking temperatures because of the concrete infrastructure, the paved infrastructure that really, really absorbs the solar radiation and then really emits it back and heats things up. And so people have really talked about, let's put street trees on and use street trees as a cooling effect. And again, people have done surveys and studies to show that, yes, having trees on the landscape have a cooling effect. But if you have a higher diversity of trees, you get much more of a cooling effect, right? Again, why? Because they're being efficient in filling in all of those spaces a little more intimately. And therefore, being much more efficient at sort of where they exist. So you have multiple different species fulfilling different functional roles. And then this here again is just a scientific way of showing all of the different things that these plants can do. Obviously shading and keeping the microclimates cool, but also the transpiration, the cooling effect when trees, emit moisture back into the atmosphere, and the same akin to what we do when we sweat, right? We cool down by sweating. Or the Australians, they don't use air conditioning. They use what's called a swamp cooler, where they turn dry air into moist air, and that has a cooling effect. It's the same principle here. You're getting transpiration that's cooling, but they can also purify the air, right? They take up CO2, they take up particles, and hold on to the particles, particulates. And then they also can be beneficial because they can reduce the runoff of impervious surfaces and therefore prevent flashy flooding and things like that. So there are a whole variety of different things that trees can do to overcome some of the harmful effects that happen in the city. If you look on a shoreline, this is especially important with sea level rise along the eastern coast of the United States, with storm surges and things like that. Obviously in Pennsylvania also, it's an issue. And what people are thinking about doing is putting these storm barriers, retaining walls, to prevent the erosion that happens when you get flooding and heavy wave action. But there's no wildlife here, right? If you actually thought about the plants that are naturally evolved to hold, the sand and the sediment on the shoreline, and utilize those like cordgrass, salt marshes, and things like that. Not only do they stabilize this environment, they also create an environment for biodiversity. So you're using nature as an engineer to build infrastructure that protects the shoreline, protects you against storm surges and damages to property. But at the same time, it encourages wildlife to give there. So you end up with more biodiversity here. And this is obviously on ocean coasts, or sea coasts, but you can also imagine doing these kinds of things inland along water courses, especially major rivers like the Susquehanna or the Delaware, where if you get heavy rainfalls and episodic rainfalls, you get this flashy flooding that could be erosion causing. Having a shoreline that actually is stabilized by native plants that protect that shoreline is another way of minimizing the costs of damage. One of the things that is also happening along the East Coast is that the cordgrass is actually disappearing, right? And so you get these muddy patches, and when the tide comes in, it erodes all this mud and washes it out to the ocean. So you get serious erosion. And this shoreline is typically stabilized by two different kinds of cordgrass, a tall one that actually prevents and controls the wave action. It deals with the wave action and can deal with the flooding because of its height. But then there's another kind of cordgrass that doesn't necessarily always go underwater, and so it can sort of persist at a lower stature. So these are two different plant species, but they're rooted into the peat bog that's underneath that. Now, here's where we actually think about the economy again. What's happening is that you have stripers and bluefish that actually move inshore with the tide, right? And what they do, and other crab species that live inshore, they feed on a herbaceous crab, a crab that eats the vegetation. And so they control the abundance of this crab species and prevent it from overeating and damaging the cordgrass. But sport fishing now has actually started catching these striped bass and also bluefish. And so you're removing an important predator. And so there's a loss of control over these herbivores. They're exploding in abundance, overeating here this cordgrass. And then and because they're overeating it, they're also rooting into the soil and grubbing out the roots. And so that you lose the stable protection that you have in here. Who would have thought that sport fishing off of the shoreline, out in the Long Island Sound, would actually have this effect? Now, I'm not suggesting we should stop sport fishing. That's not what this story is about. But what I'm suggesting is when you're thinking about the fishing quotas, how many fish you can actually take in, maybe you should also be mindful of the ripple effects, the cascading effects that happen if you overfish this resource. And so again, this is a way of thinking holistically. Remember, I talked about we have resources that we can extract from nature, but we can also think about services that are in nature. And when we're thinking about setting up quotas for resource extraction, maybe we also need to think about what that means for what we keep in place and the service that's provided there. So we have to think more holistically. We can do it. We just have to, sort of be willing to do that. Lyme disease, the bane of all of us in northeastern United States. One thing I want to make clear, it's not white-tailed deer that are going to cause you to get Lyme disease. White-tailed deer, shooting white-tailed deer and culling white-tailed deer will not eliminate Lyme disease. The creatures that are really important to Lyme disease spread are white-footed mice, these little critters, because they carry the larval ticks, the little tiny ones that you don't barely see. They're the ones that come on your body and transmit Lyme disease into your body. Those are the ones, where you wonder, I've never saw a tick on me. How did I get Lyme disease? That's why you get it, okay? Now, we have red foxes historically that controlled their abundances. The other thing is when you get masting years, those are years when nut trees like beech and acorns and everything have a real huge amount of acorns or nuts that they release onto the ground. That's important and a whole huge amount of food for these little mice, and they really thrive. So one of the things we find is that in mast years, following mast years, you usually get higher incidence of Lyme disease on the landscape because of this feeding dynamic. Red foxes keep these animals in check, right? And especially in an urban environment, maybe we want to encourage having red foxes in our backyard because they help prevent Lyme disease spread. A lot of us, when we see red foxes running around in our neighborhood, which we do in New Haven, we think, wow, geez, that's a wild predator. It's going to eat my pets. Well, let's get rid of it. But on the other hand, we can take care of our pets and not let them run around as wildly, and maybe we have a benefit of nature to control Lyme disease. The other thing that we have to also discovered is that having a diversity of different vertebrates also dilutes the Lyme disease, right? So if we have fewer rodents and lizards in the landscape, you end up having more Lyme disease than when you have many. One of the things that's disrupting this, though, is the invasion of coyotes. So the coyotes prey on the foxes, and then there are fewer foxes to control the mice. And here's just the math and the evidence to show that if you have a high consumption the high predation rate of foxes on white-footed mice, you get very low numbers of infected nymphs and very low incidence of infection prevalence in the nymphs. But if the foxes get eaten by the coyotes or get lost because we're culling them, we're getting rid of them from our cities, then the Lyme disease infection risk goes up exponentially almost. It really, really increases quickly. And so, again, thinking holistically, thinking about how all of these different species come together to create an economy, and if disrupting one part of the economy is a solution to one problem, it can actually create other problems like Lyme disease spread. Now, one of the things we tend to do is we like our, areas between the median strips between roadways, we like to have them grass, right? Certainly we don't want trees growing because they can block visibility or whatever. But an alternative to think about, and they do this a lot in Europe, so a lot of this evidence comes from Europe, they actually plant a diversity of wildflowers, okay? And so again, thinking about that tall grass prairie with all the different varieties of plants, what they do is they plant these plants, and so they have different, rooting depths, they have different vertical structure. The other thing to keep in mind, if you want to have this look throughout the summer, you got to plant early growing varieties, midsummer varieties, and late summer varieties. Oftentimes we just plant one kind of variety that grows in the spring, maybe not the summer or fall. And so then we ended up with this ugly denuded landscape that needs mowing. But if you really think ecologically and think about the phenology of plants and that different plant species, and that's another way of partitioning resources, right? You got early season species, mid-season species, and later season species partitioning the resource space, then you can actually minimize how much mowing you need to do and the pollution that comes with that, and actually have a very aesthetically pleasing landscape. And by the way, because these plants take up carbon from the atmosphere, you get carbon storage happening here too. Even with your mowing, we like big yards and big mown landscapes. This information, again, this is all done in Europe, where people have actually measured in various lawns and wildflower gardens, looking at how plant species diversity increases leads to increased carbon storage. Because there's more variety here to take up and store the carbon. The other thing is by switching from grass species that are shallow rooted, which need a lot of water and grow low in stature, you use a variety of wildflowers that have different rooting depths, so you don't need to water these as much. So you save money on watering. You keep a healthy green environment instead of this turning brown if you don't water it in the summer. And also you boost the carbon cycle, right? Instead of having mowing and the emissions that come from mowing, you have less mowing going on, and you get more take up of carbon, more protection of the soil. And the interesting thing here, a healthy, functioning, diverse meadow can take up and store a similar amount of carbon per acre as a forest can. Who would have thought that? But again, think about the soil and the deep soil. That's where the carbon's being stored, not in the tree trunks and all of that. It does much better than even a similar sized grass lawn. This again, information from Europe, not so much done here yet. So there's a lot of opportunity to apply some of these lessons all over in North America. So what I'm saying is that, we can use nature, we can use the principles of this natural economy and build our own natures in our backyard. They might look differently. We might have novel urban wildernesses where we let species come in and grow, native wildflowers, but unmanaged. It might look a little unkempt, but that could be one sort of wilderness. We can design landscapes, but make sure that we use varieties that are native and also varieties that different varieties that thrive throughout the year. But there are also cultural landscapes that we might want to keep open for other reasons. So, we don't have to turn everything into a high biodiversity landscape. And then we also have pristine remnants. And again, that use of the word pristine, we have remnants of historical landscapes, exactly the point of what the Lancaster Conservancy is trying to do as well. You've got these remnants of historical landscapes that you also want to protect. But these are different instantiations of nature that can coexist. And there's none that are right or wrong. It's just, again, how our values shape the landscape, but using nature's principles to create a landscape that's both aesthetically pleasing, but also valuable for biodiversity. And the dividend is there are ecosystem services that are also provided to us as a consequence of what we do. And, these are ideas that come from Europe again, thinking about how you use nature to create urban agriculture. Green walls is a big thing in Europe, again, where they're using green walls as a way to collect pollutants and store carbon. Urban street trees again, urban woodlands. Green roofs is another way of mitigating heat island effects. There might be, again, aesthetic reasons. These railway tracks here, these are for streetcars. This doesn't get mowed. I was in Europe last year and it was really interesting. The streetcars actually have lawnmowers attached to the front, and as they go, they just continually mow as they're going down the rails, and that's what keeps the area mowed, the innovation there. But beside, this open pathway where you have a railway network, you do have other types of plantings, in terms of trees, and then we also have the parks and gardens. So just again, stepping back now, there's a lot of writing here and I'll slowly go through this. So what I've so far presented is what I would call a utilitarian view of species and nature. We think about how do we create a nature that's beneficial to us. But the thing is, if we're going to use species, we can't forget that species are individual living beings, right? And like we humans, we're part of a larger creation that all of us strive to exist, as well as as determined by our biological capacities, our natures, and our traits, right? And so we do have an ethical or moral obligation to see non-human species, not just in terms of commodities or curious showpieces or expendable showpieces. If we get tired of them, we get rid of them. We have to actually think about them in the way that environmental philosopher Paul Taylor called teleological centers of life, which means each living organism is trying its hardest to find its own purpose and good. That's where the innovations come from. And every individual, from plant to human, ought to have a right to pursue its own well-being and should be considered morally significant in its own right because it is a living being. And so this sort of ethical and moral viewpoint has to go hand in hand if we really want to be respectful of all of the species that we're going to try and live with and rely on to help us live a much healthier life, okay? And so this kind of thinking requires a new ethic of conservation, which I call earth stewardship. And earth stewardship is what we call is a sort of a blend of anthropocentric, that is human-centered or utilitarian values, and non-anthropocentric, which is more ecologically centered values or views. And so earth stewardship really holds that we as humans, as a community of humans, have ethical obligations to each other that's mediated through our shared relationships with non-human species and the environment. So we owe it to each other, if we want to be good citizens, to create a healthful, productive environment for each other, okay? So a golden rule of sorts should be that humankind ought to strive to ensure that the integrity, the resilience, sustainability, and beauty of all landscapes is protected, and that ranges from the human-built environment to the remotest wilderness. So nature is everywhere, it's just different instantiation. But accomplishing this means we all have an ethical duty to protect the interdependence, the cogs and wheels, and the physical environment that sustains our natural economy in all of those places. So and earth stewardship embodies cooperative planning. We have to work with each other. We can't be divided. We have to sort of come together and talk to each other, and we can talk to each other at various levels with governments, with organizations, communities, clubs, social groups, okay? We all can come together and we can all play an important hand here. And, we actually have to think of ourselves as part of nature everywhere. and feel like we have a shared responsibility for enhancing and sustaining that, and ensuring that all of creation and the evolutionary innovations that come with it exist to provide a sustainable future, okay? And this is very different from conservation, where the goal is merely to protect things and preserve things in places separate from people oftentimes. And it's different from environmental management, where the goal is just to, extract resources, but also minimize the damages of doing that, okay? So conservation and management are old ways, I think, of thinking of. Earth stewardship brings all of that together. But as I pointed out with the case with the erosion of the salt marshes and the overfishing, right? Or thinking about, the Catskills watershed, thinking about us and do we extract resources or do we keep things in place? Thinking about that trade-off, and that's how we need to start thinking about things a little more. So, human nature coexistence can be done everywhere, and we can create landscapes with different degrees of nature, and wild nature and more tamed nature. But we can reconfigure urban landscapes to connect to non-urban landscapes and create this connectivity, so that we have different degrees of nature surrounding us and growing within us and interstitial to the urban built environment. And just finishing off, I just want to leave you again with sort of the inspiration, the phrase that inspired this sort of cogs and wheels analogy by Aldo Leopold. To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So if we want to be environmental stewardship and tinker with nature, let's make sure we keep as many species as we can, or all of the species, ideally, so that we can really be humble and do a good job of that. This quote comes from the book A Sand County Almanac. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to get this book. It's very inspirational. It was written in the 1940s. And again, I'm promoting Aldo Leopold. He's a graduate of our school. So he's one of our famous alums that we often like to talk about. So with that, thank you for your spending some time with me and listening to me. And I'm happy to answer some questions.
Oz, thank you so much for the book, first of all, and for a really great presentation that distills a lot of information in this book. I highly recommend it, everybody. The New Ecology. Definitely get it and check it out. I've got a couple of questions. One is, and I think I got this from your book, at least I was teaching on it this past summer. We know things adapt, right? We know that evolution happens and things adapt. And in my mind, things in the environment are changing because of humans at a rate faster than things can adapt. Although there's research that's starting to come out that indicates that species and systems, ecosystems, can adapt at a much faster rate than what we previously thought. I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's, this is, so a lot of the historical conservation was promoted on a science that thought that there were things happened on ecological timescales, that's within our lifetime, and then evolutionary timescales, which take millions of years, right? Because we relied on the paleontological record to understand evolution. But what we're seeing is as you change things, you get natural selection happening. Natural selection is a driver of evolutionary change. And so you can get very rapid selection for genotypes of species that can deal with the environmental changes. So you can go to New York and some of the most polluted places in New York, and you can find species that can tolerate, the chemical pollutants in the environment because they've been selected to do that. Roadways, along roadways, when we salt things, the plants that live along roadways can tolerate the salt. Their sisters in that population further away can't, so, and this happens within, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It can happen within our lifetime. So we also, by changing the environment, can profoundly cause evolution to happen. And I'm not saying though that evolution will rescue us. That's the thing, like if we erode the genetic variety that allows evolution to happen, then we don't get evolution to happen, and then we screw ourselves.
Yeah. So, I think a lot of times, at least in restoration ecology, we look at ecosystems as a collection of objects, right? We want to restore a system to what this was pre-1490. as best to the best of our ability. And we make a list of things that should be in that, but we don't look at it as often anyway as a restoration of processes.
Right.
Right. And to
Right.
me, the real beauty of ecology is those processes.
Right.
And certainly those processes depend on those cogs, those individual cogs. We got to do the best we can to protect and restore those individual cogs. But the processes are what's really driving the train and what is truly fascinating. And to that end, you talked about functional diversity and functional redundancy. And I was wondering if there were any examples out there where species were replaced in an ecosystem, but maintain that same function with new players in that system.
Um, I think I don't know any cases immediately offhand. Um, but the thinking, I mean, the problem is it conflicts with people's sensitivity. So the one case example I can talk about is in Australia, right? So in Australia, they lost a lot of the marsupial predators because humans got rid of them. And the food web linkages got eroded and the food webs got simplified. But then they introduced foxes and domestic cats and everything. So if you think about the food web linkages, that's been restored to what you historically saw, but with very different species. But these species are species that are not valued by Australians as being wild species, right? And so this is where you get the value clashes in terms of, we wanted the original species, you can't de-extinct them. So, here are some functional analogs that we can bring back or bring into an ecosystem to restore the functionality of an ecosystem. And I think that's, with climate warming and species shuffling and moving, we're going to get species from southern United States up here. We have to think differently. We can't, if we're trying to protect the species that were there even 50 years ago, we're fighting nature and we're going to have a losing battle. So I think, that's why I like the functional approach. And just finding species that are functional surrogates for
Yeah.
what was once there.
And even that affects the planting lists. Our forests are often
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
selecting species on the northern end to their southern range,
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
northern species on the southern end of the range.
Yeah. Right.
So that
Right.
it'll propel that
Yeah.
facilitated migration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
For sure. For
so I
sure.
think I just wanted to end with a quote from the end of the book here, which I think for me anyway, as somebody who works for a land trust, trying to protect and restore land, and also understanding the importance of that. Nature is everywhere. It's not in these little protected pods, but it's among us. And we have a couple of urban preserves, Windhoff Landing and Holly Point, and hopefully that will grow over time. But moreover, this is right from your book. Well, moreover, what does it mean ethically to have an important hand in driving a creative process that has given rise to the dizzying variety of life we see today, and one that will shape what we see in the future? And I certainly see us as land managers as that creative force now, right? The treatments that we apply to that land, either to restore a meadow or to eliminate invasive species or to encourage a certain type of forest, um, we have a huge ethical obligation to do that in the right way.
Yeah.
And I was really happy that you ended with that Aldo Leopold quote about, our tinkering should not eliminate any of those cogs.
Right. Right.
And I often liken it when we train our volunteers in eco restoration. It's the Hippocratic Oath: first, do no harm,
Right.
right? Which is really difficult because a
Yeah.
lot of times in eco restoration, it's a black box. The science isn't always quite there. It's so site specific at times to go in with a large degree of certainty that the treatment that you're going to apply to that landscape is actually going to have a net positive effect. And it's always a nail, like I do a lot of controlled burn work, and it's always a nail biting. And we never call it prescribed fire, because once you put fire on the ground, it's not controlled anymore.
Right.
But it's always a nail bite, not
Yeah.
only to pull off that
Yeah.
particular burn in a safe way, but then how does that system respond in 1 year, 5 year, 10 years down the road?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So thanks again. I can't thank you enough for the great book, for the amazing lecture. Tune in
Okay.
next week, everybody. We have our next lecture on February 5th on our emancipation landscape. So not only do the places we protect enhance the diversity that Oz was just talking about, that functional diversity, and I think helps to bridge the gap between humans and nature, and helps get people into nature, so we recognize that we are nature and nature is us. But those landscapes have also played a really significant role in our history, including the Underground Railroad. And Peggy Eppig, our conservation educator, is an expert in Underground Railroad and pilgrimages and the important role that our preserves and this landscape played in that. We also have our last Nature Hour, February 19th, discovering our spring ephemeral wildflowers. That's gonna be with me. You're stuck with me for a lecture that night. One of my favorite topics because, winter gets a little bit old after a little while. We have this amazing ecology that is reflected in the beauty of these spring ephemeral wildflowers. That'll be February 19th. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.